Tanjung Offshore is rated a sell with a target price of 90 cents. 2009 net profit forecast is cut by 21% and DPS payout is now expected to be nil in 2009 to 2011 as the company's ill-fated UK operations continue to weigh down earnings. Consensus forecasts are too optimistic, valuations are high and the balance sheet is heavy with no re-rating catalyst in sight.
Welcome back to Stock Watch, and joining me live in the studio is Datuk Dr Zainal Aznam, and we're talking about the budget 2010, which will be tabled in a week or so. Now, before the break, we were talking about how the government plans to reduce its operating expenditure. We've had some hints so far from the second finance minister. He was talking about monetizing assets in KL.
Yes,
what exactly does he mean by that?
Well, if I can sort of make a guess, it has to do with this approach of looking at the very sizable physical assets, for example, land, property, buildings, in the whole, say, city centre, right throughout the peninsula. You take Kuala Lumpur, for example. I think government owns a very sizable portion of the land in the city. And they have moved from Kuala Lumpur, Wilayah Persekutuan, to Putrajaya over the last couple of years. And I don't think that the assets, the wealth in the urban areas have really been fully utilized. They have not been monetized, for example. I think, and they have been undervalued, I think, for many years. So the market rather has been fragmented. You have this land and assets owned by a government, which is not sort of priced at market value. So they've been undervalued. And then you move to Putrajaya, and then these assets are not fully utilized. So I think the time is I think timely that the government really look at it in a much more comprehensive way. I think the last one or two budgets, they did try to make attempts, I think, to try to monetize its assets. I think they were rather very small attempts. I think this time I'm expecting a much more comprehensive approach to how they're going to utilize this hidden wealth of the public sector for the benefit of the country. For example, huge source of land.
But realistically speaking, I mean, can the government get enough revenue from these assets?
I'm not too sure, but I feel that nobody really knows. That it's not transparent enough. I've asked this many times about if I want a stock value estimate of the government land, say even in Kuala Lumpur, Wilayah Persekutuan, because when they shift the capital to Putrajaya, you're left with an overhang of these huge substantial assets. Nobody can tell me how much they are worth. Yeah? But I don't think that even though you can monetize it, that you're going to help very much for budget 2010 in trying to contain your fiscal deficit. At least it will make a contribution. But you have a very comprehensive plan over the next couple of years, and you do it properly, then that may have a big impact on the revenue collection of the government.
Okay, let's move on, Datuk, to wish lists from the people. Yeah. Now, in an unprecedented move, of course, the Prime Minister has asked Malaysians to share their wish lists on his blog, onemalaysia.com. Judging from the response, it seems the man on the street wants, in this order, toll collection to be abolished or at least maintained, petrol prices to be reduced, cheaper imported cars, discounts to lower income groups for homes, and finally cheaper airport taxes, amongst others.
Right.
How realistic are these requests?
Well, these are always traditional requests. I think any budget, any government is faced with this kind of request. How to reduce and ease the fiscal burden of the average household. But I think it's also, the wish list is, I think, has been made in a much more brighter condition, because I think evidence shows that the household is not in severe debt on the average, not like the United States, for example. Yeah? Household debt is very substantial there. So I think this is an additional request to further relieve, I think, to ease the burden on consumption items, service items, and things like that. As is always usual, they will have to weigh the request. I'm sure they've done some crude simulations that if they do sort of agree to the request of each of the items generally, for example, in a generic sense, how much would they lose, right? And then whether they could sort of counterbalance with that losses in potential revenue from some other sources. And I think they're going to be tight. I think that this particular budget, you're not going to see very significant increase in taxes, I think. Yeah? They're going to contain, I think, the tax. So that means that the government is under pressure now. How much could it, in fact, meet the requests of the average Malaysian sort of electorate? Yeah? I doubt, even though if they agree, I don't think it's going to be all the way. I think it's going to be possibly a token kind of easing the burden on various items you mentioned. I don't think it's going to be a big giveaway kind of budget because of the fiscal deficit.
Speaking of taxes, I'd like to bring up a question from our viewer, Victor Ao Yong.
Yes.
He brings up tax and a couple of questions. First of all, will the government consider putting in a framework for GST to be implemented in the near future? And the other one is, he asks, will the government put in place any measures to reduce the parity between corporate income tax and personal income tax?
Right, okay. Well, the GST, I think, ought to be one of the top items in the coming budget 2010. But that is not something very new or radical. It has been talked about for many, many years, and the government decided to defer, I think, some years ago to the implementation of the GST or the value-added tax. I feel that the time could be right over the next 1 to 2 years to start introducing the GST. Simply on one key factor, that the government simply must introduce a new source, a major source of revenue generation. Because it no longer can rely on a major cash cow like Petronas from your oil resources, which accounts for about 40% of the total development expenditure or revenue of the government. And they have been doing this for years, umpteen years. So the pressure on Petronas, I think, is fairly strong over the last, 8, 9, 10 years. So it's time now to introduce a new framework of a consumption-based tax rather than over-dependence on a resource-based petroleum income tax through Petronas dividend and other corporate tax of the oil producers, for example. So I think this is about time because it takes some time. I don't think the government can say we need more time because they have been given a lot of time over the last couple of years. And I think that the market talk is that you might get some very strong indication about a possible GST or a value-added tax this particular budget. And the key thing I think people are waiting for is if it's going to be introduced or announced, what could be the quantum of the tax? My guess is that it's not going to be very, very big. Okay. It's going to be a broad-based, small tax, which will hit the consumers much less than we thought.
Okay, we'll just put that thought on hold for a second. We're off for another commercial break, and we'll continue that train of thought right after this.
I'll take that one in a second.
Toto is rated a sell with a target price of RM4.05. Punters are spreading their money around, spending less per draw rather than digging deeper into their pockets. In addition, Magnum's new 4D jackpot is diverting punters from B-Toto's lotto games. Downgrade to sell on poor revenue prospects and rising regulatory risks.